Something shifted overnight in ways that are going to take days to fully understand. And the honest version of what happened is more complicated and in some ways more unsettling than the most dramatic framing you'll find circulating right now. Somewhere in Tehran tonight, a phone that used to ring with coordinates and target lists is either destroyed or disconnected. And somewhere else in that city, an IRGC officer who used to receive those calls is trying to figure out who's supposed to be giving him orders now. Residents across the Iranian capital were woken in the middle of the night by loud explosions. Air defenses lit up simultaneously in districts on opposite sides of the city. And for the first time since this phase of the war reignited, the fighting felt to the people living through it like it had arrived at the center of the country, rather than remaining a coastal southern problem they could watch unfold from a safe distance. Whether that overnight activity in Tehran represents a direct confirmed American strike on Iran's most senior command infrastructure, or something closer to Iranian air defenses reacting to American aircraft operating elsewhere in the country's airspace, is a distinction worth taking seriously rather than glossing over, because the honest answer sits somewhere between the two, and getting it right matters a great deal more than making the story sound as dramatic as possible. Here's what's actually confirmed, and it's worth going through it carefully because the gap between confirmed fact and reasonable inference is exactly where a lot of the most important context lives right now. United States Central Command ended its evening strike wave at 9 o'clock Eastern Time on July 15th, stating plainly that its forces had struck Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities using precision munitions against targets in multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas specifically. That's the official language, essentially word for word from the release itself. And it's worth sitting with exactly what it does and doesn't say, because both matter equally here. It confirms that command centers were struck. It does not specifically name Tehran, the IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters, or any particular building inside the Iranian capital as a target. The only location CENTCOM named directly in that official release was Bandar Abbas, the southern port city that has been struck repeatedly throughout this entire campaign, going back to its earliest phases. Separately and independently, Iranian sources, including the IRGC's own FARS news agency, confirmed air defense activations in both the eastern and western districts of Tehran overnight, and CNN reported a Tehran resident describing being woken suddenly by loud explosions with no extended warning beforehand. Those two things, a CENTCOM statement confirming command center strikes without naming Tehran, and separate Iranian reporting confirming Tehran air defenses activated the same night, are being reported together by essentially every major outlet because they happened on the same night, not because either government has directly and officially connected them to each other. It's entirely possible, even likely given the established pattern of this war, that both are true and related. It's also the kind of gap between official confirmation and inference that's worth naming honestly, rather than collapsing into a single, more cinematic claim about IRGC headquarters going dark, because that specific claim, however plausible it might be, hasn't actually been confirmed by anyone with the standing or authority to confirm it. And in a conflict this serious, the difference between what's confirmed and what's inferred matters in ways that go well beyond just getting the details right. What is fully confirmed is the scale of human cost accumulating over this stretch of fighting, and it deserves to be stated plainly and given the weight it actually carries. Iran's Ministry of Health said Thursday that at least 35 people have been killed and more than 300 injured since this round of fighting resumed roughly a week ago. That's a real, sourced number from Iran's own health authorities, not a battlefield claim from a military spokesperson with an obvious interest in shaping the narrative. And it deserves to be treated with the same seriousness and weight as any other confirmed casualty figure in this conflict. 35 confirmed dead in a single week of fighting, with more than 300 wounded, is not a number that gets absorbed quietly into the background of geopolitical analysis. It's the actual human ledger of what's happening on the ground while governments issue official statements and military commanders talk about precision munitions and degraded capabilities. Also fully confirmed is CENTCOM's earlier action that same day, a 90-minute strike wave hitting coastal defense and cruise missile sites on Greater Tunbih Island, part of the string of forward positions Iran has used throughout this conflict to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts tracking this campaign have specifically flagged Greater Tunbih and the other island positions as facilities that function less like genuinely defensible military assets at this stage of the war and more like exposed, difficult to resupply outposts that are increasingly vulnerable to exactly this kind of standoff strike. The logic of striking them repeatedly isn't purely about the individual missiles or radar systems destroyed in any single raid. It's about making the forward position itself untenable as a place from which Iran can credibly threaten the shipping lane that runs past it. Separately, the IRGC claimed it intercepted and shot down an American MQ-9 Reaper drone over Andimeshk in Khuzestan province. The United States has not confirmed that claim, and as with most single-source Iranian battlefield claims throughout this conflict, it's worth holding it as reported rather than settled until it can be independently verified. Whether that claim ultimately holds up is a separate question from whether the underlying capability exists, and it's worth watching carefully whether U.S. Central Command issues any confirmation or denial in the days ahead, because a confirmed drone loss would represent a real, if narrow, tactical success for Iranian air defenses at a moment when essentially all of the available evidence points in the opposite direction. If it does get confirmed, it tells you something meaningful about what survived the campaign's targeting of Iran's air defense network so far. If it doesn't, that tells you something equally meaningful about the state of Iran's ability to accurately assess and report its own battlefield performance. Now the tanker engagement, because this is where the war's economic dimension and its military dimension are colliding most directly and most visibly right now. CENTCOM fired Hellfire missiles into the smokestack of a Curaçao-flagged tanker as it attempted to reach Karg Island, Iran's primary crude oil export terminal, a facility that handles the overwhelming majority of the country's oil exports to international markets and represents an enormous share of the Iranian state's hard currency revenue. The vessel was disabled rather than sunk, and that distinction is a deliberate targeting choice rather than a missed shot. Crippling a ship's ability to move without necessarily killing the crew aboard it accomplishes the blockade objective while avoiding the kind of mass civilian casualty event that would significantly complicate American diplomatic positioning internationally. That's not a symbolic gesture or a warning shot. It's a direct physical enforcement action against a specific economic target in broad daylight, and it tells you something clear and unambiguous about how Washington intends to run this blockade going forward, not through warnings and diplomatic notes that get ignored, but through disabling ships that ignore them with no further warning required. The economic logic behind targeting Karg Island's maritime access is worth spelling out plainly because it connects directly to the broader strategic architecture of what this campaign is trying to accomplish. Oil revenue from Karg Island funds a meaningful share of the Iranian state's ability to sustain its military operations, procure replacement weapons for an inventory that's been consumed across more than a week of sustained American strikes, and support the broader network of regional proxy groups and allied organizations Iran has relied on throughout this conflict and in the years preceding it. Every tanker turned away or disabled at Karg Island is a direct cut to that funding stream. Layered on top of a blockade the Pentagon has already said cost Iran billions of dollars in lost revenue during its earlier phase back in April, that's not peripheral economic pressure on the margins of the conflict. It's an attempt to directly constrain Iran's ability to resource the fight it's currently engaged in, while simultaneously destroying the military assets that fight depends on. That economic pressure isn't limited to Karg Island either, and the broader regional picture is worth including here because it illustrates how exposed Gulf energy infrastructure broadly has become to the ambient risk this war is generating. A drone struck near a tanker at Iraq's Basra oil terminal complex in the same general window, prompting a precautionary suspension of loading operations across the country's southern terminals, the facilities responsible for the bulk of Iraq's roughly 3.3 million barrels per day in export capacity, which places Iraq among OPEC's most significant contributors to global supply. It's worth being precise about the actual scale of that specific incident, rather than inflating it into something it wasn't. Iraqi officials described the drone as not appearing to specifically target the Basra terminal, said the strike caused no damage and no fire, and confirmed that loading operations resumed at normal rates within a relatively short time frame. Nobody has claimed responsibility for launching it. That's a real documented disruption, but it's a brief and contained one rather than a sustained shutdown of Iraq's entire export infrastructure. The more measured version of that story is also the more accurate one, and accuracy matters more than drama here. What it does illustrate clearly, even at that contained scale, is how the ambient threat environment created by this conflict is beginning to affect energy infrastructure well beyond Iran's own coastline, regardless of who's actually behind any individual incident. It's worth noting that Karg Island itself isn't new to this war's targeting logic. Back in March, CENTCOM struck more than 90 separate military sites on and around the island in a single raid, deliberately avoiding the oil and gas infrastructure itself while destroying the air defenses, naval base facilities, and control systems protecting it. That was a strike Trump described at the time as sending a warning rather than an attempt to destroy Iran's actual export capacity directly. This week's Hellfire strike on a tanker attempting to reach the island represents a meaningfully different phase of pressure on the same target. Not destroying the port's physical infrastructure in a way that would require enormous reconstruction and generate massive international criticism, but making it operationally dangerous for any vessel to actually use the port, a subtler but arguably more sustainable form of economic strangulation than a one-time bombing raid on fixed infrastructure, since it doesn't require repeated costly strikes on the same targets so much as a standing willingness to intercept any ship that tries to breach the cordon. Layer those pressure points together, the Karg Island blockade being enforced with live fire, reduced Strait of Hormuz transit volume affecting the broader global market, and periodic disruptions at Iraqi export terminals even when those disruptions are brief and contained, and you get a genuinely serious cumulative effect on global energy markets, even when each individual piece is smaller than the most alarming framing suggests. Global energy markets don't process simultaneous pressure on multiple major supply nodes the same way they process a single isolated event in a single location. The uncertainty compounds across the system in ways that individual assessments of individual incidents can miss. And the longer this particular configuration persists, weeks rather than days, the more a temporary conflict-driven price premium starts looking like something closer to a structural supply problem, reflecting genuinely reduced physical availability of Gulf crude reaching international buyers rather than just market anxiety about what might happen next. Now it's worth spending some time on the platforms most likely involved in strikes reaching deep into the Iranian interior, because understanding the hardware genuinely helps explain what's operationally different about this phase of the campaign while being honest about where confirmed fact ends and informed analysis begins. CENTCOM, as a matter of standard operational practice, doesn't typically confirm the specific aircraft or munitions used in any individual strike. So what follows is analysis grounded in known American capabilities and publicly available doctrine rather than a CENTCOM-confirmed account of exactly what flew over Tehran last night, and it's important to hold that distinction clearly. The B-1B Lancer is a supersonic heavy bomber capable of carrying large numbers of long-range standoff missiles, including the JASSMER variant, a weapon with a range exceeding 500 nautical miles. That capability is precisely what would allow the United States to strike deep interior targets within Iran without requiring the launching aircraft to fully penetrate whatever remains of Iran's air defense envelope. Paired with F-35s providing the sensor picture, target identification, and any remaining air defense suppression needed to clear the approach, that combination represents a meaningfully different strike architecture than the coastal packages used in the campaign's earlier phases, which could operate in closer proximity to the targets they were hitting because those targets sat within or near the air defense gaps the campaign itself had already opened up. Whether that specific combination was actually used last night is something only official confirmation, which hasn't come, could settle. What is entirely reasonable to say is that reaching targets deep inside Iran's interior from outside the densest concentration of Iran's remaining air defense coverage requires exactly this kind of long-range standoff capability, and the United States has spent the better part of a decade building and refining precisely that capability in scenarios that look very much like this one. It's worth explaining briefly why a long-range standoff missile like the JASSM-ER matters so much for this specific category of target, because the mechanics genuinely shape what a strike on a command center looks and feels like from the perspective of the people inside and around it. A missile with that kind of range lets the launching aircraft stay well outside the effective engagement envelope of most surface-to-air systems, while the missile itself flies the final leg of the mission autonomously, using a low radar cross-section specifically designed to make it difficult for remaining air defense radar to detect, with enough time to mount a meaningful response. For someone inside a targeted building, that translates into strikes that arrive with little or no detectable warning. No approaching aircraft noise building for several minutes. No radar warning system going off in time to matter. Just an explosion where moments earlier there was a functioning command post. That's part of why the reports of Tehran residents being woken suddenly by loud explosions rather than by an extended period of visible air activity beforehand are consistent with this kind of strike architecture, even without official confirmation of the specific platform or munition used on any particular night. Even without that confirmation, the B-2 Spirit remains the platform hovering over every serious conversation about where this war goes next, because Trump has specifically and repeatedly named Fordo Mountain. the deeply fortified facility in Iran's Natanz region, as the target it's being held in reserve for. The B-2 can fly directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, penetrate contested airspace using its stealth configuration, deliver the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator against deeply buried hardened targets, and return home without needing forward basing anywhere in the region. That specific bomb was engineered for exactly the category of target Fordo Mountain represents, and Trump has said publicly in his own words that the facility is primed for what he's described as a big shot. None of that means a strike on that facility is imminent or already decided. It means the specific tool built for that exact job is sitting ready, and the president has said in his own words and in public that it's coming. Those are two different things, but both of them matter. It's worth stepping back and looking at the shape of this campaign's targeting progression across its full arc, because the sequence itself tells a coherent story, even if no one has officially described it as a deliberate progression. The earliest nights of the campaign focused on coastal radar systems, fast attack boats, and missile storage directly relevant to the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's ability to threaten shipping through it. The following nights hit island positions like Keshem and Greater Tunb, the forward operating points Iran has used to project force into the shipping lane. After that came sensor networks and communications infrastructure, the connective tissue linking dispersed Iranian forces to central coordination and command. And now, command centers themselves. That progression isn't necessarily proof of a rigid, predetermined plan laid out in complete detail on the first night of the campaign, but it does reflect a recognizable military logic. It's considerably harder to strike deep command infrastructure effectively before degrading the air defenses protecting the approach to it. And it's harder to degrade those air defenses before disrupting the radar and communication systems that coordinate them. Whether this sequence was designed exactly this way from the outset or simply evolved as each phase created the operational conditions for the next, the practical effect on Iran's military coherence is the same either way. Before moving to Iran's own signaling, it's worth spending a moment on why degrading command and control infrastructure specifically, as opposed to simply destroying more missiles or more boats, changes the character of a conflict like this one in ways that go beyond straightforward attrition. A functioning military command structure does several things simultaneously that a list of destroyed hardware can't fully capture. It synthesizes scattered sensor and radar data into coherent targeting decisions. It connects political leadership to the people actually operating weapon systems on the ground and at sea. It allows an organization to calibrate the intensity and direction of its own response deliberately, rather than letting individual units act on their own initiative and their own risk tolerance. When that structure degrades, whether through direct strikes on physical command nodes or through the kind of institutional fragmentation already visible in Iran's leadership since February, the capability underneath it doesn't necessarily disappear. Missile launchers, drone teams, and fast attack boats that survive don't stop existing just because the network coordinating them has been disrupted. What changes is whether their actions still reflect a coherent strategic decision made at the top of the chain of command, or increasingly reflect the judgment and the risk appetite of whoever happens to be holding launch authority in a given province on a given night without clear guidance from above. That's a meaningfully more dangerous and less predictable situation for everyone involved, including the United States and its partners in the Gulf, than a war being run by a single coordinated adversary making deliberate, calculated decisions, however aggressive those decisions might be. Now, what's Iran actually doing on the other side of all of this? Because the country's public signaling this week has been genuinely contradictory. And that contradiction is itself one of the most informative things about the current state of Iran's internal decision-making. Iran released Dana Kari, a U.S.-Iranian dual national who had been effectively trapped in the country since December of 2024 under what her attorney described as a coercive exit ban rather than formal imprisonment, following repeated interrogations by Iran's intelligence services on accusations her legal team characterizes as entirely fabricated. Trump publicly thanked Iran for what he called a gesture of goodwill. In the same general timeframe, Iran's foreign ministry stated the country has no plans for negotiation. The IRGC continued firing on commercial vessels in the Strait, and Iran's army spokesman said publicly that a significant portion of the country's military capability remains unused, warning that Iran's response could exceed what its adversaries expect and potentially open entirely new fronts. That combination, releasing a detainee as a gesture of goodwill while simultaneously threatening escalation, continuing military operations against commercial shipping, and explicitly ruling out negotiation, reads less like a single, carefully coordinated two-track strategy and more like exactly what you would expect from a government whose internal coordination has been genuinely disrupted at the institutional level. It's worth noting, too, that Qari's release doesn't resolve the broader detainee picture in any meaningful way. At least 3 other American citizens, 1 woman and 2 men, remain held in Iran, according to Hostage Aid Worldwide, a non-profit organization that works with the families of detained Americans abroad. Whatever backchannel produced this single release is still at best a partial and incomplete diplomatic thread rather than evidence of a broader thaw in conditions or a genuine shift in Iranian policy toward American detainees. The release matters and deserves to be acknowledged, but it shouldn't be read as more than it actually is.